Thank you so much for having me here. I am extremely glad that I was provided with the opportunity to take a workshop. Um, as you can see in front of you on the screen, I have hopefully been able to present my screen for the general community's benefit. The workshop that we are taking today is about understanding burdens and burden fulfillment. I think now is a good time to start the workshop. I think we have already waited for quite a while for a lot of people to join in. So, without further delays, once again, thank you so much for having me here, Kaushik. I'm extremely grateful for the opportunity. It's always glad to be of use to the community in general. Moving on, then, let us briefly discuss the nuances of why essentially an introduction to burden of proof is the most important, arguably the most important aspect that people should be focusing on, and is often enough an aspect that a lot of intermediate debaters or even beginner debaters miss out upon purely to their own disadvantage. I think primarily it is very important to understand that when you have a debate motion in front of you, the motion requires certain aspects or certain things to be discussed. While that is very intuitively something that a lot of people get, you must understand that it also stems from the factor that this is also an intuitive understanding of what you feel like is a burden that you have to fulfill within the debate. You might not look at it that way, but intuitively, any argumentation or analysis that you put forward in a debate room is essentially built or targeted towards fulfilling a particular burden of proof or going ahead and substantiating why you think one argument or one analysis from your side stands in the debate. That is essentially how a debate room works, or that is essentially how judges also go ahead and take into consideration the arguments that you might have or the arguments that you might put forward in the debate forum. With that in mind, then, why essentially burden of proof becomes a foundational factor for argumentative analysis? Often enough, what happens or what ends up happening on a regular basis is that when we look at a motion, we perceive particular aspects about the motion, certain things that we feel are easier for us to understand, or maybe easier for us to engage or entertain, or maybe easier for us to talk about, deal with, or maybe you know about these particular aspects. Then that is why it gives you the confidence to be like, okay, I should probably just go ahead and talk about this a little bit more on why this might be right, wrong, subjective, or dependent on extraneous factors. The reason why this is important to understand is because while at the same time your own understandings or biases or your own clarifications about the world are important and do play a key role in the debate, it is not always so that the things that you're talking about are the things that necessarily need to be talked about for a particular debate round to go on. Which means to say then that if we look at debating as an activity where you wish to go ahead and have an empirical analysis on whether certain aspects of your speech, certain components of your case building, or certain parts of your developmental process should focus on understanding which burdens of proof is necessary and which burdens of proof are not necessarily that necessary for the debate to proceed or for you to have a chance to win the debate. It is here that foundation of argumentation would rather proceed on an analysis where you would much likely have a tangible benefit if you do go ahead and follow a strict road of understanding which burden of proof is necessary for a debate. In simple terms, then it means that if I have a motion, I can obviously choose my burden of proof, but certain burdens of proof are better than the others or than their counterparts, which means then that naturally there are more than one burdens of proof in a debate, and hence you can choose any or as many as you want, but it would extremely depend upon the debate strategy that you wish to utilize for that particular round, or the class points that you want to generate within that particular round, or the sort of focus that you want to push for in a particular round. Not every particular motion is going to have the same set of burden analysis that you can do. And this is very important because if you're not able to fulfill burden analysis, it can very easily be a key factor for an adjudicator to probably not consider you as a team that deserves to win or that deserves to take any of the positions in a particular round. Let us say this goes equally as importantly for all formats of debating, including APDs and BPDs and WSDC formats or other formats as well. Moving on then to a clearer understanding of what the foundational burden of proof looks like. First of all, what is burden in a debate? Right. Whenever you go ahead and talk about any particular case from your end, be it a case that a proposition has to put forward or a case that opposition has to put forward, the teams have an initial responsibility to prove something. And that is what we know as burden of proof. The affirmative team has the initial responsibility to prove that the resolution is true or should be adopted, while at the same time, they are going ahead and advocating for something that we know as a change in the status quo. So, regardless of motion types, you will look into motion analysis and you'll find that a lot of motions automatically require either of the teams, either prop or op, to go ahead and understand a problem and then explain a solution set and then use that solution set as a modification towards the status quo. The argumentation analysis that comes then, especially in policy motions as well, is a burden push on proposition to go ahead and explain why they think that their solution set is a solution that should be adopted. Here is the thing. If in this particular round or in a debate you're not able to fulfill the set burden of proof, the chances are that you probably are not going to go ahead and get a tangible position in a BP debate, like maybe first or second, or in a top row, maybe even a third. And in an AP debate, you might not be able to secure a win. On coming on to the analysis of what burden of the rejoinder looks like, basically the negatives responsibility, the opposition often enough has the duty of a twofold burden of proof. First of all, it is obviously to go ahead and disprove the affirmative's case, and then to go ahead and successfully disprove the fact that the status quo needs a change. Now, here the words proposition and opposition do not automatically go and talk about a team standing in a debate or like a team's positioning. The utilization of these words is to go ahead and provide you an understanding of what a classic prop and a classic op is expected to do in a motion set. With this understanding in mind, now you have a bare bone idea that yes, burdens of proof exist. Proposition's burden of proof is almost always to go ahead and explain number one, why a change is necessary. Number two, how is the proposed solution that they are talking about going to benefit the status quo by its integration or inculcation. And similarly, the negatives burden of proof often end up happening to be either number one, why there is no need for change at all, or number two, even if there is a need for change, why their own solution, which is something that is very popularly known within the debate community as a counter proposal, is something that is extremely necessary or important, or probably more favorable than what proposition has to provide into a debate. Now, this might sound like a classic policy debate to you, where you have proposals and counter proposals, but without us realizing, a lot of other motion formats or motion types, or a lot of the times even framings of motions, actually make us debate these very things only. We end up debating this particular aspect only of whether a change is necessary, and if yes, then what sort of changes are necessary, what can be its consequences. Basically, we might not feel like it's always a hard fact based policy debate, but more often than not, we are actually just discussing whether changes or implementation of certain aspects or removal of certain aspects from the status quo, basically any changes to the status quo, are as impactful or not, or would it be beneficial to any aspect for any particular, be it community, be it any particular stakeholder, be it any particular actor, etc., etc. So I think with that basic understanding or basic scope of awareness about burden of proof being established, let us move forward further into what essentially the importance of understanding burdens is. I think automatically arguments become better if you are able to understand what burden of proof you have to fulfill. Let us take a very easy example. If I have to prove why in a particular financial market, banks are almost always the best course or like the best actors to have your money like safe and secure. I don't automatically need to go ahead and talk about why an average human being should be investing in agriculture. I mean, I can probably take a longer route, probably some way tie it back to the original burden of explaining why your money is probably safe with the banks or like safer with the banks than your homes. But even then, it is not necessarily the most important burden of proof for me to try and automatically go ahead and prove to you why essentially human beings should rather not keep money in their homes at all, and like should just go ahead and invest it in agriculture, maybe buy a land, buy some crops, etc. Yeah, later on I can go ahead and develop it into some sort of a weird argumentational analysis, like that is probably going to give us more return on investment, because now don't only have assets, but you can also utilize these assets by selling them, trading with them, or like utilizing them to create further resources. Like for example, you can utilize agricultural products that you get, and like you can go ahead and trade them off in multiple ways, etc., etc. And at the same time, this also nullifies the fact that you don't have money in your home. But that is not always automatically a burden of proof that an average individual should choose. An average individual will go ahead and talk about the burden of proof of: number one, if I have money, I should not keep it at my home, because number one, my home does not have, let us say, the latest security features, or even if it does, I don't think that the security that I can provide within my own home is as good to go ahead and keep, let us say, lump sum of money, lump sum of resources, or things like that. Or number two, that the bank is also a good place to go ahead and keep your money, because number one, they don't only assure you that they'll keep it safe, but they'll also go ahead and assure you of the fact that they are going to utilize this money, make it grow, and probably give you a small percentage of increment on the money that you have, just so that you just, if you don't go ahead and touch it, etc., or like don't utilize it in any manner, basically. So there are ways you can establish a burden of proof. Right now, I just discussed three very simple things. In the three very simple things, the first thing is, in the primary argumentation analysis, I went ahead with the primary burden of proof, that is going ahead and saying why banks are a better actor than, or like banks are a better place than your homes to store your cash. The secondary burden of proof was to go ahead and talk about investments and return on investment. That even if I go ahead and keep it in banks rather than store it at home, or is there an alternative place where I can keep my money and go ahead and get maybe some return on investment, because anyway it's sitting, the money is sitting somewhere or the other in any case, right? So that is a secondary burden of proof. While in the second line of argumentation that I had about investing in agriculture, I was more fulfilling of the secondary burden of proof, of trying to prove to you why essentially keeping that same money invested into agriculture is probably going to get me a better return on investment. But in the primary push that I had, I was going ahead and simply talking to you about just an analysis on why I think that like that banks would be a better actor to just keep your money with in the first place. The reason why all of this is contextually not as important as of now is because we don't really know the framing of the motion. Now, let us consider whatever I've been rambling on has been kept aside and just discuss a particular motion. If I have a motion that says this house believes that it is better to keep large lump sum amounts of money at banks rather than at homes, then my first burden of proof about investing money into agriculture has a little less significance into the debate, because that is about growing your money and that has nothing to do with the debate in its primary essence. While if the motion were to be, this house believes that storing your money, or this house prefers storing money in banks over other alternatives for the growth of this particular money, then my first primary argumentational push of that probably I can go ahead and invest it in agriculture is a better argumentational analysis that can be taken forward if I am able to go ahead and do a proper impact analysis of it and go ahead and explain why I think that there's a greater probability why you are likely to make money off of agriculture than off of maybe the standard return on investment that you get of investing in banks. But that then becomes a discussion of impact analysis. However, the reason why we did this very small exercise was to go ahead and have an understanding of what the importance of understanding the burdens of the motion are. You can never really understand the burden of a motion by just looking at keywords. You have to understand the emotion in its entirety to know whether you feel like this is something that needs to be taken care of from your end as a burden of proof. The crucial burden of proof then is automatically going to make your case, as stated here, better in an argumentatively constructive manner. Number two, more effective in engaging with the opposition, because if the opposition is also going ahead and fulfilling the accurate burden of proof, then they will also automatically become counterintuitive to your case, which means that you will have better engagement with your opposition if you choose to. And number three, improved navigation of debate complexities that you might have in terms of just understanding the nuances of how an adjudicator is going to make the final decision call within the debate room based on what you have put forward as an argumentation analysis. I think that sufficiently puts forward into perspective why there is a particular importance that is always associated to understanding what burdens of proof are, or like why essentially a particular burden of proof for a particular motion is more important than maybe other burdens of proof that might or might not exist. Moving then to the types of burdens in a debate, that is basically beyond just going ahead and talking about why we have to prove something as true or false in its very binary form. Different levels of proof is something that is dependent entirely upon the wording or the framing of the burdens in the motion itself. We discussed five types of burdens in this particular aspect. Number one is logical burdens. Logical burdens are essentially specific burdens that generally exist. Yes, logical burdens are specific burdens that generally exist with the analysis that you prove this resolution to be true in a specific number of cases or under particular conditions. This is where you make intuitive argumentations, like going ahead and saying that at least one instance where something like this is acceptable is probably an instance that you can talk about, can use as an example, and go ahead and make an argumentative analysis out of. These are very specific burdens of proof that require rhetorical explanation in terms of you going ahead and explaining why you think that on a scale or on a frame an arbitrary policy can still go ahead and come to a particular outcome without you referring to status quo at every point in time as a tangible proof of that said outcome, which means that this is completely dependent on an analytical slash rhetorical slash logical basis, which means that becomes a logical burden of proof on your end to go ahead and discuss in a debate. Moving forward, then, into the second burden proof type, which is a general burden of proof. The definition for a general burden of proof is to prove the resolution is true most of the times. That is, on an even if argumentation, rather, sometimes as seen in an even if argumentation, you go ahead and just talk about yeah. You go ahead and just talk about what essentially a most likely case is going to happen. For example, in a motion like nationalism ought to be valued over globalism, an affirmative task for this particular burden of proof is to just go ahead and probably argue that nationalism is probably more important to the majority of the situations, like in terms of any tangible benefits that it might have on the economy, in terms of tangible benefits that it might go ahead and contribute towards to particular stakeholders, which can go ahead and become useful, etc., etc. These are general burdens of proof where you like most often than not when you go ahead and create even if arguments and like you go ahead and understand that the even if argumentation is also based on the fact that there's a general likelihood analysis that is probably going to come from your whip speech or further on into your debate, where you go ahead and talk about a general analysis of why you think that there's a greater likelihood of this happening in the first place. The third thing then becomes the logical burden of rule burden of proof. I think this is a very nuanced case that you need to understand. The definition of rule burdens essentially come from the fact that you prove the resolution is true enough to be considered as a rule, which means that these are things that you do not necessarily go ahead and let us say in depth explore it in depth into a particular argumentative debate. You go ahead and establish that in an affirmation. You go ahead and utilize that in your reasoning, and you move forward directly to impact. It is here that certain burdens of proof are often used so much so that they become a tangible rule that can just be followed, like okay, I can say this or I can quote this particular burden, and this burden becomes a tangible rule that we have to follow in the debate, right? The emphasis then that happens is on most conceptually applicable truths. Like for example, if I go ahead and say that mutual funds are, let us say, not as reliable as a fixed deposit, while it can be that there's a greater chance that mutual funds have like the capacity to maybe make more money for you, it is still more let us say uniformly accepted as a rule that mutual funds are subject to more risks than your standard FD will be. And this is where I did provide an assertion. I did provide some amount of reasoning, but I did not have to go ahead and explain to you the intricate analysis of what mutual funds look like, the intricate analysis of what FD looks like, and then the intricate comparative analysis of why I think that mutual funds are far more likely to be a good alternative than, let us say, FDs in terms of going ahead and measuring reliability. If I were to do that, a judge would probably say it's an unnecessary overkill because it's intuitively okay for us to get that, okay, Mutual funds are probably not as beneficial, or like let us say as reliable to invest into as let us say a fixed deposit is. This is a point that you can go ahead and consider as a ruled burden. Things that have been proven often too many times to become something that you don't have like a general exception to. And the rare exceptions that do exist will automatically not be considered for you as, let us say, a burden of proof that falls under a specific burden, which is why this becomes a rule burden. The fourth one then is logically impossible burdens. Now, these are good. These are burdens that you see like a lot of the times come up in sudden top rooms where like debaters try to go ahead and model their cases out on burdens of proof that, let us say, might not be as relevant or might not be as implicably important when you look at it the first time, or when you try to engage with it the first time onwards, like, because exception to the rule is basically what these logically impossible burdens talk about. The definition of a logically impossible burden is to prove that while a rule might generally be true, there are too many expected exceptions. This means then that if I go ahead and have a proper common notion that is already preset within the debate, things that, let us say, an ordinary intelligent voter is much more likely to engage with in a manner that goes ahead and tells us that, okay, this is far more likely to be true than it actually is. So these are points or places where a hypothetical example like this is like very good here, where they talk about a bird in the hand is worth two in the bush, ignores too many scenarios. Here is the thing. These are analysis or argumentations that are based out on prejudices that are far too common and that may have gone through changes, particularly within the status quo. This means to say that if I go ahead and say right now that yes, due to capitalism or due to, let us say, over aggressive professionalism within the like medical industry, there's a greater likelihood that medical healthcare professionals are going to con you of your money or go ahead and have you do like a lot of tests that might not be relevant, that might not be, let us say, useful to you, or that might not even have a particular tangible benefit, as is a very preconceived notion. This notion is so pushed on in certain democracies or in certain economies to the point that for a lot of judges this can automatically become a point of a bias. This can automatically become a point of a rule burden, that they are going to willing to acknowledge this particular burden and go ahead and agree that this as a burden is fulfilled without expecting a debater to go ahead and provide explicit analysis as to why they think that there's a greater likelihood that the people's mindset towards the healthcare industry is that the healthcare industry is probably going to con them off of their money. But the logically impossible burden here is to go ahead and talk about exceptions to the rule and go ahead and argument in a manner that, okay, number one, healthcare right now is probably as developed to the point as it is because people are willing to go ahead and trust in their healthcare, to the point that I go ahead and create further argumentation and analysis in this and link it back at the end to go ahead and prove to you why this initial burden that looked like a rule burden is probably not as true, because healthcare develops every day, every point in time, and a lot of changes have been made in healthcare policies, a lot of changes have been made to make sure that things like these don't happen. And hence it might have been a status quo in the past where the healthcare professionals had a greater incentive or an easier access to con the average human being, but is probably not as true in the current present because of the circumstances. These are logically impossible burdens. These require you to go ahead and challenge pre-existing norms that like are so prevalent to the point that they might generally be taken into consideration as true. This means that there are too many exceptions out there, but the average narrative is so strong about these that people look at them and think that, okay, automatic fulfillment, which is where these are termed as logically impossible burdens of proof. The last logically impossible burden of proof is an absolute burden, where you go ahead and prove the resolution which is completely true with no exceptions whatsoever. Like, for example, a motion like this, where you have no one should ever receive a life sentence without parole. The fact that a negative team in a motion like this is disadvantaged to a degree because of the fact that the negative team is far more likely to think that what essentially is our case, like why would people, why should people like receive a life sentence without even getting a chance at parole? I mean, the entire essence of judiciary systems in multiple places are based on being reparative than at the same time being just completely, let us say, rather than just being criminal ostracizing in nature. I think this is essentially a very important part of CJS debates, where you go ahead and have to understand the role of the judiciary, where essentially the responsibility of judiciaries in most democracies are far more incentivized to try and get a human being to understand the mistakes that they have made and to utilize that chance in a way to rectify themselves so that they can be integrated back into the society, rather than the fact that they deserve unequivocal punishment for the crimes that they might have they might have gone ahead and uh, committed. This is where a logically impossible burden of an absolute burden of proof exists, where a negative team wins simply by just identifying one valid exception to the fact of why no one should ever receive a life sentence without parole, like circumstances, situations, analysis, argumentations that can go ahead and tell me that yes, this is one circumstance where a person who has received a life sentence should still be given the chance at parole, and hence is a burden of proof that I'm fulfilling in going ahead and telling you why not everybody who receives a life sentence should be allowed to just go ahead and get parole, or these people should just automatically be taken off of the rack and should automatically just be killed. The reason for this is burdens of proof like this exist. If you go ahead and tangibly draw out a debate where you talk about cases, or rather, if you are able to talk about the frequency of cases in which people are wrongfully accused of crimes or are wrongfully judged to have committed a particular crime because of lack of, let us say, resources from the departments that are aiding the judiciary in getting the evidences, or because of the lack of incentives from departments like law enforcement to go ahead and produce optimum results through their investigations, and hence, let us say, convenient judiciary proceedings take place where, if you are able to put a particular man in the place of the crime, it automatically increases the chance that this particular human being is the criminal and hence committed. But at the same time, if you're able to prove that this particular aspect is far too common in the community right now, and hence changes in the adjudication process, or the judiciary processes are far more common, where essentially people who have been provided life sentences often get called back and they are often reevaluated, their cases are often gone through again, only to find out that there might have been, let us say, oversimplifications, or things might have gotten overlooked, or these individuals might actually been not guilty, which is basically one very important absolute burden of proof that you can go ahead and fulfill in a debate like this. Because very frankly, for a negative in a debate like this, which essentially, by the way, none of these motions that we are using are completely balanced, which means that basically just fulfilling this one particular burden of proof is going to be more than sufficient for a negative team to have fulfilled something that we would term as a logically impossible burden or an absolute burden, something that is so fixed into the minds of an individual that okay, if a person has already gotten a life sentence, there's no point why this individual should be given a parole, which means that they are a criminal who does not necessarily require human compassion on reproach. Things like these things that are so hard set into the human emotion or into the human thought process, any burden of proof that challenges a certain particular aspect from a human being in this manner is something that you would consider as an absolute burden of proof. Now, why was it necessary for us to go ahead and discuss all of this different types of burdens of proof, in whether they are logically possible or they are completely impossible to go ahead and fulfill? I think the important analysis here is to understand the sort of burdens that you guys have been proving in debates. I mean, for a lot of the times, given the scope of my adjudication experiences, I have seen a lot of teams choose a lot of burdens of proof. A lot of the times, these are burdens of proof that might sound daunting, or that might sound like, okay, as a team going ahead and targeting a particular burden of proof, it might feel like to an average debater that if I am even trying to fulfill a burden of proof like this, it maybe automatically provides me with a credibility or with a particular value in the debate room, because I'm automatically looking for, let us say, maybe a logically impossible burden on an exception to the rule plane, or maybe you have just landed upon a logically impossible burden that's absolute in its terms. But often enough, this means that you are far more likely to not win that round, because you're far more likely to not know exactly how to establish a logically impossible burden to the point that an adjudicator actually vies you for it and actually goes ahead and gives you a particular win. Which means that an understanding of the burdens of proof that you might have for a motion, which can obviously be more than one, and to go ahead and discuss properly with your teammate, understanding what sort of burden of proof are you looking for. Maybe it can be some number of rule burdens followed by a particular general burden of proof. All of that together could probably have assured that you win a particular round, rather than just assuring you that you probably will not end up making it to the next round, if it's a qualifier round basically. So I think this is where an analysis or an important awareness of what sort of burdens you are choosing in the debate is going to help you out a ton, because now you can just stop your subconscious from making exceptional problems to your case building or case prefing sessions. Because I have seen that a lot of people are trigger happy to the point that they would almost always willingly take up logically impossible burdens, because they feel like if they are able to prove this substantially, they will have a guaranteed first in the room in a BPD. But often enough, if they are not able to fulfill that, they end up happening a guaranteed third in the room, because they are not able to engage charitably with other teams as well. Due to these huge amount of nuances that are involved post the selection of burden of proof, it is much more feasible for a debater to understand exactly what they are supposed to prove, and then go ahead and try to fulfill the same with the pragmatical amount of argumentation analysis necessary. Hence the importance of burden of proof. Moving on then to motion types and typical burdens, right? This is where a lot of the examples that I was using is probably going to come in handy as well. Motion types like policy motions, where we have motions like THW, or like often motions that are like value based motions, and this house believes that, this house prefers, this house opposes, this house supports, or like factual motions as well, often enough that are based on like THBT motion types as well, or even actor analysis motions similar to policy motions, often enough can be categorized into these particular aspects. Policy motions and actor motions generally require general burdens of proof, where you go ahead and have to talk about why benefits outweigh the harms in a likelihood scenario, which means that these are motions where you go ahead and talk about likelihood analysis far more than in other motion types, where you go ahead and analyze whether your policy or your counter policy has a greater chance at making a particular tangible change that you're talking about, etc., etc. In the same manner, for value based motions in THP, THS, THO, THPT, analyzing and prioritizing values means that you're far more likely to be talking about rule burdens. Here, rule burdens are here for your context, or you're far more likely to be talking about specific burdens of proof rather than general burdens of proof in a particular motion type of value based motion analysis. While, on the other hand, in a factual motion analysis, even if it's a THBT format, it is far more likely that you'll just be proving a truth or falsehood of a statement analysis, which does not have much to do with likelihood, and which almost always has a lot to do with the sort of argumentational push that you have in either it being a logically impossible burden to prove, or it being a logically possible but a specific case burden to prove that you might have to utilize for these particular motion types. Understanding motion types, hence, also helps a little bit in burden analysis. But here is something that helps the most and is unprecedented in like in every other aspect for you to understand what burdens of proof you're supposed to have. And that is the framing of the motion. That is the phrasing of the motion as well. So this is where it becomes important how you go ahead and deconstruct the motion type to go ahead and analyze what the burden of proof is. So analyzing the motion. First of all, this means understanding the core question. Here is a word that we essentially often associate with understanding the core of the debate, that is crux. You understand the crux of what the debate is about, there's a greater likelihood that you are going to go ahead and land upon the appropriate burden of proof that you're supposed to go ahead and prove for a particular round, right? Which means that what does this proposition mean, especially during prep time? This is where you go ahead and simply attack the motion in a manner that goes ahead and asks the question, okay, what is the proposition expected to do in this debate? Like, what is something that I can actually do in this debate that can go ahead and actually create some amount of change, or that can actually go ahead and fulfill the burden that I have to prove in this debate? And this is a very important question, because this question then automatically asks you or automatically pushes you to look inquisitively towards the motion itself, right? Where you go ahead and understand the government's responsibility in understanding and defining what the essential motion requires of you. For example, understanding the motion's phrasing, like whether this is the THBT motion, whether this is a THW or a THP motion, is often enough indicative of the sort of obligation that you have to prove a particular burden in a particular motion type. And that is very important as well. But this is not entirely where a motions framing is going to go ahead and end up being, because a lot of the times motions phrasing are also dependent on these particular set framings that we have, whether the motion is framed as a THBT or a THW or a TH prefers motion. The phrasing itself has also a very important role to play in this particular analysis, where identifying core obligations are going to go ahead and explain to you why demonstrating a particular change is necessary for a particular round, or to go ahead and make a proper solid decent case in terms of why you are pushing for a certain argument than the other. Often enough for people it happens that they go ahead, look at the motion, the first argument that comes to their mind is the argument that they run with. They're like, okay, to hell with it. But the most suitable approach to a debate is to think of a series of arguments, to think of substructural analysis that satisfies all these said series of arguments, then to make the choice of argument based on two things. Number one, which arguments most fulfill the given burden of proof. Number two, which arguments most fulfill either a very pragmatic way of looking at the debate or a very principled way of looking at the debate. It is here that actor motivations, essentially going ahead and understanding what actor analysis would look like for the debate. And this does not restrict itself only to actor motions, like, for example, this house as it restricts itself to more motion types as well, like, for example, THW, which is also a hidden actor motion of sorts more often than not. And it can also be motion types where this house supports or this house opposes framings are utilized, or this house regrets framings are utilized as well, where sometimes you might need to go ahead and do some amount of actor analysis. You might always need to go ahead and do a lot of stakeholder analysis. You might also always need to go ahead and look at what the pragmatic or the practical mechanization could look like, where you go ahead and fulfill certain burdens that are specific to motion framings just by the essence of its framing itself. Like, for example, regrets motions require you to go ahead and talk about a regret metric, as often quoted, or regrets motions require you to go ahead and talk about a counterfactual world. What does your alternate world look like? The same way where a policy motion would require you to go ahead and talk about, let us say, a particular policy or a model that you might have to engage with in the particular round, or let us say in a this house prefers X over Y, or this house prefers X debate, where you go ahead and have the burden of proof of understanding what X looks like and characterizing X, and Y as well if it is a X over Y. And if it's just a this house prefers X, then the opposition debates the status quo analysis of why they think that the status quo is a better alternative to be in, regardless of whatever X says. Or it can also be a motion type like this house prefers a world where X or Y, and this is where you do a world building analysis, and that can also be a part of, let us say, a practical mechanism, things that are automatically expected of you just because the motion has been framed in a manner where it is either THP a world, THPX over Y, THPX, or it is THR, or it is a THW, or it might also be a TH as. These were the motions that I was talking about. Moving on then to thinking about the standard of proof. First of all, going ahead and explaining what a particular probability, possibility, and what a particular beyond a reasonable doubt argumentation analysis is looking to be like. This is where you go ahead and understand the depth of argumentational, let us say, strength that you have, especially in understanding what the standard of proof is that you require to set. So often enough this happens that you do end up choosing a burden of proof which you feel like is more viable for the particular motion that you have, based on the framing or based on the motion's framing. But often enough the problem that ends up happening is that you do not necessarily know to the depth to which you need to prove it, which is essentially also something that backtracks its way to the types of burdens that you have to prove, because there is no need in over explaining a rule burden, but there is absolutely an extremely important need to go ahead and explain, let us say, a specific burden which is a logical burden, or let us say to explain a logically impossible burden in a hyper specific manner because of the fact that it challenges existing norms. Which means then that the analogy that we follow here is, number one, you go ahead and talk about the probability, which goes ahead and establishes why you think that the logically impossible burden is not so logically impossible, or why you think the proper specific burden is not so specific. Number two, the possibility that there exists or there does exist a tangible chance that this is probably also an alternative norm that has not been explored or has been far more underexplored or disregarded, which is the reason why it is not a prevalent part of the social narrative currently. And lastly, then you go ahead and explain impact using impacts or using pragmatics, if that is what your push is, or using impacts on principles to go ahead and analyze why beyond a reasonable doubt, the probability and the possibility that you were talking about means that this is a particular burden of proof that does need to be considered for the round, and hence that does need to be fulfilled, which means that influencing factors rely on two things: A, the type of claim, and B, the potential consequences that these particular claims have. It means that every time that you choose a burden of proof, it means that you have to first understand what type of burden of proof is it, what type of claim are you putting, whether it is logically plausible or impossible, and at the same time to go ahead and understand whether there are particular potential consequences or potential impacts that are also, let us say, associated with you probably going ahead and explaining a particular burden of proof in a way that it goes ahead and changes a social norm, or in a way that it goes ahead and explains a deeper analysis of what a prevalent norm might look like, but is also something that might not be true. Which means then again, here different burdens imply different standards, and every burden will have a specific standard that you will have to fulfill. This means then again that if you follow the ARE format of going ahead and having argumentation analysis first, assertions basically, then the reasonings, then example followed by explanation, tailoring the evidence and reasoning accordingly is something that again comes in sync with the AREA format for the different burden types that you might have. Which means then thinking about the standard of proof of a particular burden often enough links back to the intricate understanding of the burden itself, whether it is something that you need to push as a specific burden or a rule burden, or maybe it is not a specific burden, maybe it's an absolute burden that is logically impossible and you need to do a lot of work to go ahead and prove it. This is not something that you are likely to get correct by, let us say, inherently understanding it or going with a vibe check. This often enough will require you to empirically understand the probabilities, possibilities, and how to go ahead and push it to a beyond a reasonable doubt circumstance. Otherwise, there's a greater likelihood that even if you make this bravado attempt in this particular round of yours to go ahead and try to prove a particular burden of proof, at the end point, the only thing that tangibly ends up happening is that the judge doesn't buy into your argumentation analysis and you lose the round, which is something that then leads you to a conclusion of whether you were actually wrong about the burden of proof or did you not prove your argument enough. And it can create severe gaps in your learning experience because you then don't necessarily know what are the things that you should actually be focusing upon. And this is where this workshop also becomes important for judges as well, because often enough it is also hard for judges to go ahead and explain why they think that the team was not able to do the necessary requisite amount, despite them feeling like, yes, the team did take up a very strong burden of proof. What this does is this affects the speaker scores that the judges might give, or this goes ahead and, let us say, conforms to particular biases that the judges might have toward, let us say, contributions and efforts that they feel like if a person has made an effort in the room, they probably should be given some amount of reparative, let us say, benefit out of it, while that might not be the case, etc., etc. Which means then that all sorts of faulty adjudication or all sorts of faulty learning can come just from the factor that you did not know what a proper burden of proof would look like or what a burden of proof should be taken into consideration. Moving on then to the next analysis that we have is in terms of burden fulfillment through constructions of persuasive arguments. Now, I think I have um, continuously taken a non-interactive structure to this particular workshop, which means to say that please don't feel like this is completely going to be non-interactive throughout, because at the end of the workshop, I intend to take a live Q&A where any questions, any concerns that anybody might have can be raised, and like I'll try my best to go ahead and engage with the same. I'll try my best to go ahead and answer the same as well, because I think Q&As were something that like was seen as a much favorable addition to the workshop that everybody seemed to be suggesting or recommending in the registration forms that we had. So we'll follow and comply with the same as well. But before that, let me tell you then that This is going to continue for 10 more minutes, where I will wrap up the last phase, that is the phase 4 of this particular workshop, and then we'll continue forward into a Q&A session for the next 15 minutes before we wrap up. All right, then. Moving forward to burden fulfillment, constructing persuasive arguments is something that is the most important thing, or arguably, I would say, the cherry on the top that a lot of you might be waiting for right now. Because, I mean, over the understanding of the fact that, yes, there are burdens, there are different burdens. Yes, even if I choose a particular burden mistakenly, this can create a particular pitfall. And yes, even if I choose a burden, right, I have to understand the degree to which the burden needs to be proven. Yes, all of these considerations exist, but how do we do that? How do we actually implement it on the real life scale? Well, this is your answer to the implementation of a real life scale. That is, as the slides title says, moving from analysis to action. Constructing persuasive arguments to meet your obligations is something that goes ahead and that goes ahead and impacts your case building to a far greater degree. So let us look at, what does a prima facie case look like? Presenting sufficient evidence and arguments at first sight to establish the claim and warrant further discussion. Which means that, first of all, your cases should not be built in the idea that a burden of proof at some point in time might be a tangible thing that a judge is looking for. It simply means that your burden of proof or your case should just start with the fact that this is a strong enough claim to justify further debate on it. Which means then that if you understand exactly what degree of burden of proof you require to take for a particular motion, let us say involving or not involving an actor, the case that you build initially and automatically starts off with the clarity of understanding of what the burden of proof is that you are going to talk about, be it a logically possible specific burden or a logically impossible burden. And then you go ahead and create a case according to that, which makes it strong enough to justify the further debate on that side of the paradigm. This is where you ensure two things. Number one, that this makes your opposition go ahead and engage with your debate, because you did not start by just going ahead and trying to fulfill the burden of proof. You started by explaining why your burden of proof of choice is automatically an important argumentational line of thought that needs to be explored for the motion. Which means then you are saying that if the motion is a problem statement, and the case that you have built is a solution statement, you are just explaining why you think that the solution statement that you have to bring to the table is far more relevant to the problem statement that you have at hand already. Hence, the terminology presenting sufficient evidence and argument at first sight to go ahead and establish that this particular claim of yours warrants or requires further discussion. Moving forward then to what the key components of a prima facie case are. Number one, you must have clear definitions and interpretations of the motion. You enter the debate as the prime minister, you go ahead and explain into the motion analysis as to why you feel that this is what the motion requires you to talk about. Number two, these are the definitions that you have utilized to be the most charitable about the motion analysis that you have. Then you go ahead and put forward logical and well reasoned arguments supporting the resolution. You then go ahead and talk about the burden of proof that you have. But before you explain the burden of proof itself, you explain the choice of burden of proof as to why you think that this particular burden is something that prima facie requires you to go ahead and engage with, and requires the opposition to engage with as well, so that they can create a holistic debate, or so that they can create a holistic discourse, because you feel like this is the most important burden of proof that needs fulfillment. Number three, then, clearly articulate the intention of the outcome or the impact. The most possible tangible way that you can go ahead and grab the attention of an actor, or grab the attention of a particular judge or the opposition team, is to go ahead and label or characterize a particular impact that you are much more likely to prove later down the debate, later down through the flow of the case that you have to put forward. And lastly, an explanation of how the case proves the motion and why proposition should win this particular round. These two argumentational pushes should come in the later half of your speeches, or in the secondary speeches that we have from the deputies and the whips, to go ahead and create an entire case structure that looks cohesive enough to the point that no opposition can go ahead and neglect this particular argumentative analysis unless it is for their own peril. Moving forward, then, to strategies for burden fulfillment on both sides. First of all, well structured arguments should be there. Like, you should always follow ARE formats or other formats that you are much more, like, let us say, attuned to or have been trained with. follow relevant evidences and examples that can be utilized for the same, which means that every time that you are putting forward an analysis, if you feel like an ordinary intelligent voter is not likely to be aware about a lot of these circumstances, or even if you feel like an ordinary intelligent voter is likely to be aware about the same, it's often enough good for you to go ahead and provide relevant evidences and examples to go ahead and substantiate the same. Directly addressing the resolution is also something that goes ahead and becomes a very important part of how you go ahead and approach the debate, and then actively responding to opposition's arguments, maintaining consistency across arguments, and yes, lastly, a clear, confident way of going ahead and fulfilling engagement within the round is something that you're supposed to fulfill. Opposition's initial framework, then, since we have already talked about proposition, let us also go ahead and talk about opposition's initial framework. Prop and op initial framework will be like, let us say, something that you go ahead and find within this substructure itself. The initial framework then talks about how a burden of proof is going to be influential for a particular round, going ahead and talking about why you essentially focus on the debates aspect in this particular manner and why you think that this is more relevant, and lastly talking about the strategic framing that helps your burden fulfillment to a far greater degree. With that, I think we have come to an end for the first discussion that we have in terms of going ahead and fulfilling the burdens. Let us have a short, brief Q&A session that we can utilize to follow through with clarifications that might be necessary, or any sort of understandings that you feel like is something that you wish to discuss. Kaushik, if you are here, could you please help us with a clarification? People, you can just drop your
Yeah,
questions in the chat space.
just give me like a second. I'll allow people to unmute themselves. Yeah. Whoever has a question, please feel free to ask for Jyoti.
Somewhat minor question, but what does SEA stand for?
You're kind of breaking. Could you please repeat?
Sorry, slightly minor question, but what does SEAL stand for?
SEAL is another format of, let us say, argumentative analysis. It's same. It has colloquials that are similar to, like, I might not be aware of the exact terms, but the colloquials are similar to the AREA format that we follow in India, like, or that is something that is more prevalent here.
All right, thank you.
Right. Any other questions? Sure, handing over to you then. Let's just wrap up then accordingly. ARE format, I think is the question that one of the guests have. What is the ARE format?
All right. It's basically assertions, reasoning, explanation, then analysis. Basically, it can also be like in the format of assertion, reasoning, examples, then analysis. This is basically a format which expects you to go ahead and, number one, put forward the assertion on the floor that you have, then go ahead and explain the reasoning that you have for the said assertion that you have already explained. Then go ahead and provide an example that substantiates or backs up the claim, and if necessary, you go ahead and provide an in-depth analysis to why you think, number one, the example fulfills it, number two, the reasoning is appropriate for the said assertion, etc., etc. Any sort of explanation that you feel is important for the establishment of the said assertion. That's the ARE or AREA format. The exact wordings of any of these particular formats that, like, are there are developed in more of a rule of thumb manner, like, which means to say that none of these are, let us say, things that are set in stone in any sort of manuals, etc., that like require you to know exactly what each of these formats mean, but these are things that are, let us say, developed from time to time by different coaches across different debate institutes, which they then utilize to go ahead and explain to people why it is far easier for them to just, um, let us say, inculcate this sort of mnemonic in their head, to go ahead and understand what they are supposed to do one after the other. Or this is also sometimes used by WSDC coaches or trainers, because they then allow their students to have a structured speech, like where the students, like, first of all, go ahead and iterate the part of the argument that they are giving. Like, they go ahead and say that here is the assertion that we have, then they go ahead and say that here is the follow up reasoning to it, and then they go ahead and talk about an example to like substantiating. These are basically mnemonics used for like building blocks, in the manner of building blocks for people to go ahead and develop their debating skills. That's all. All right. Are there any other questions? Any questions pertaining to like burden fulfillment? Any particular questions with regards to burden analysis? Anything?
Right. So I don't think there are any other questions in the chat. You can continue.
All right, fair. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining in. I hope that this has been an instructive session for you guys. Look forward to going ahead and engaging with you guys again, maybe in some tournament, maybe in the future. It was great to have you here. It was also great that I was allowed the opportunity to go ahead and be a part of this amazing event. I think a series of workshops are also planned and coordinated forward by our esteemed host, Mr. Kaushik Das. Kaushik, could you please take over? Talk to the community about other workshops that you might have planned, etc., etc. Thank you so much for having me here.